The Vorathi did not knock. They never knocked. In 300 years of expansion across 7 star systems, the Vorathi fleet had never once announced itself with anything softer than an orbital bombardment. Their arrival was a statement of physics, mass, velocity, and the thermal bloom of 200 warships decelerating into a system's gravity well. And yet, as Commander Esrelva stood on the bridge of the dreadnought Asterisk consuming dark and watched the blue-white planet rotate slowly in the forward viewport, she found herself doing something she had not done in 40 years of conquest. She hesitated. Commander, her tactical officer, a young male named Dasketh, touched a claw tip to his sensor console with the delicacy of someone afraid of what the instruments might say. The human vessels have not moved. Esrelva already knew this. She was watching it herself. The 17 human ships sitting in high orbit above the third planet had not scattered, had not formed a defensive line, had not attempted to hail the Vorathi fleet with any of the desperate, begging transmissions that characterized the final hours of every species the Vorathi had ever encountered. They were just sitting there. Magnify, she said. The viewport sharpened. The human ships were ugly things by any aesthetic standard, blocky, asymmetrical, covered in sensor arrays and weapon pods that jutted out at strange angles, as though the builders had simply bolted on whatever seemed useful without regard for elegance. The Vorathi valued form. Their warships were sweeping curves of dark alloy, graceful as the predators they had modeled them on. The human vessels looked like they had been assembled in a hurry by someone who had never heard the word symmetry. But they were not moving, and that bothered Esrelva in a way she could not fully articulate. "How long since we entered sensor range?" she asked. 14 minutes 30 seconds, said Dasketh. 14 minutes. In 14 minutes, any rational species would have either launched an attack, begun an evacuation, or opened communications. The humans had done none of those things. Their ships sat in orbit with the casual stillness of vessels whose crews were not particularly alarmed. "Com traffic?" Esrelva asked. Her communications officer, elder-ranked Fis, consulted her board and made a small, confused sound. "Yes, Commander, substantial com traffic," but she paused. "None of it is directed at us." "What?" "They're talking to each other, and to the surface. I'm picking up what appears to be internal fleet communication, civilian broadcasting networks, something that might be entertainment media." Fis trailed off, her neck frills flattening with discomfort. "One of the channels appears to be a cooking program." The bridge fell silent. Esrelva stared at her communications officer for a long moment, then turned back to the viewport. "They know we're here," she said. "It was not a question. Their long-range sensors would have detected us when we dropped from fold space," said Dasketh. "Yes, Commander, they know. And they're watching a cooking program. Among other things, there also appears to be significant traffic related to something called the Granfeld Protocol. Multiple channels, high-priority encryption. Whatever it is, they've been preparing for it." Esrelva had conquered 42 worlds. She had faced species that fought with claws, with energy weapons, with biological agents, with the desperate courage of creatures who knew they were going to die. She had faced species that begged and species that bargained and species that simply froze in the headlights of Vorathi power and waited for the end. She had never faced a species that responded to invasion by continuing to watch cooking programs. "Open a channel," she said. The human who appeared on the comm screen was not what Esrelva had expected. She had studied the human intelligence files, of course. The Vorathi always studied their targets before arriving. She knew the humans were bipedal, mammalian, bilaterally symmetrical, operating within a normal temperature range for carbon-based life. She knew they were young as spacefaring species went, barely 400 years since they had achieved stable orbital platforms, barely 200 since their first colony ship had crawled toward a neighboring star. What the intelligence files had not fully conveyed was the specific quality of the human's expression. He was male, she believed. The files had detailed the sexual dimorphism markers, and he appeared to be of middle age by human standards, with short gray-streaked fur on the top of his head, and a face structured around two forward-facing eyes that were, at this precise moment, crinkled at the corners in a way that the translation matrix identified as amusement. He was smiling, a wide, easy, utterly relaxed smile. Behind him, Esrelva could see the bridge of one of the human vessels, the flagship, she assumed, though it was as cluttered and inelegant as the exterior suggested. Crew members moved around in the background. None of them appeared to be at battle stations. "Vorathi fleet," the human said, in a voice that carried no detectable stress hormones even through the translation lag. "This is Admiral James Ockafer of the Earth Defense Coalition vessel Persistent Argument *. Welcome to the Sol system." He paused. "We've been expecting you." The words were delivered with the cheerful warmth of a greeting, not a threat, but something about them made Esrelva's secondary heart rate spike. "You have been expecting us," she repeated. "About 6 weeks, give or take," said the human. He tilted his head slightly. "You hit the Seth colony on Outer Terminus 4 months ago. The Seth are skittish people, God bless them, but they run fast when they're scared, and 3 of their transports made it out. One of them came here." He paused. "We've had time to prepare." Esrelva looked at her tactical display. 200 warships, the accumulated military strength of the Vorathi hegemony's 5th expansion fleet. Enough firepower to render a planet's surface uninhabitable in approximately 6 hours of sustained bombardment. The human had 17 ships, and he was smiling. "You understand," Esrelva said carefully, "that your force is insufficient to repel this fleet." "Oh, absolutely," said Admiral Ockafer. He said it with the easy agreement of someone conceding a point about the weather. "We're not going to fight you, not today anyway." Another pause. "We were wondering if you'd like to come to dinner." The silence on the bridge of the consuming dark lasted for a full 7 seconds. Esrelva was aware that her crew was looking at her. She was also aware that she was staring at the human on the comm screen with an expression that was probably unbecoming of a Vorathi commander of her rank. "Dinner," she said. "Dinner," confirmed Admiral Ockafer. "It's a meal. You eat food, we eat food." Seemed like common ground to start from. "You are inviting a Vorathi fleet to share a meal." "Well, not the whole fleet, obviously. We don't have a table that big." He scratched the back of his neck, a gesture the translation matrix flagged as casual, informal, potentially conciliatory. "Say, your senior command staff, maybe a dozen. We'd bring a dozen as well." "Neutral shuttle, your choice of location. We suggested the station in L4 orbit, but if you'd prefer the planet's surface or one of your ships, we're flexible." Esrelva had, in the course of her career, received many unusual communications from species facing conquest. Pleas, threats, philosophical arguments. Once, memorably, a fairly sophisticated poem about the impermanence of all things, which she had found surprisingly affecting before ordering the bombardment to begin. No one had ever invited her to dinner. "Admiral Ockafer," she said slowly, "do you understand what the Vorathi are?" "Apex predators," said the human without hesitation. "Hypercarnivorous, obligate. Your digestive system can't process plant matter worth a damn." He paused. "Ours can, for the record, but we mostly don't bother. We like meat too." He said the last words with a different quality. Still casual, still warm, but there was something underneath them, a subtle shift in register that Esrelva's threat assessment instincts noticed and filed. "You like meat," she repeated. "We do," Ockafer smiled again. "There's a reason we understood you immediately when we saw your files, Commander, predator to predator." He leaned slightly forward. "Come to dinner. We'll explain the Granfeld protocol. You can decide after whether you still want to conquer us." He paused. "I think you'll find the answer gets more complicated." Part 2, the table. The station in L4 orbit was smaller than Esrelva had expected, a modest structure by Vorathi standards, more functional than impressive, which seemed to be a human aesthetic theme. The docking ring accepted Vorathi shuttles without difficulty, which meant the humans had studied Vorathi's ship design closely enough to build compatible infrastructure. That, too, was a data point. Esrelva brought 11 officers. She wanted an odd number, for reasons she couldn't entirely articulate, something about the psychological geometry of uneven groups. She chose them for competence and also, though she would not have admitted this, for calmness. She wanted people who would not flinch. The humans waiting in the station's central module numbered 12. Admiral Akafer was among them, out of his command uniform now. He wore something simpler, dark, with no rank insignia that Esrelva could identify. Behind him stood a mixed group, humans of various builds and colorings, and this was the detail that stopped Esrelva in the airlock, 2 beings who were not human. She recognized one of them, a Seth. The Seth were small and fast and frightened of nearly everything in the galaxy, which made sense given that they were prey animals by evolutionary heritage, soft bodies, enormous eyes adapted for detecting movement in low light, quick-twitch musculature designed for immediate flight. They had achieved spaceflight through intelligence alone, because they certainly hadn't achieved it through any capacity for violence. The Seth were so thoroughly non-threatening that the Vorathi had barely bothered to study them before beginning the annexation of their worlds. This particular Seth was standing next to Admiral Akafer with an expression that, on a human, Esrelva would have described as determined. On a Seth, it looked like a small miracle. "Commander Esrelva." Akafer extended a hand in the greeting gesture the files identified as a human handshake. When Esrelva looked at it without responding, he lowered it without any apparent embarrassment. "Thank you for coming. This is Liaison Speaker Veth of the Seth Diplomatic Corps, and Fleet Analyst Marrow of the Prothean Compact." The Prothean, the other non-human, was tall, tripedal, with a hide like rough bark and eyes set wide enough to give near 360-degree vision. Prey animal configuration again, Esrelva noted. The Protheans, unlike the Seth, had not been formally conquered, but only because their world contained nothing the Vorathi particularly wanted. They were generally considered irrelevant. Both of them were here, standing next to humans, looking, if not comfortable, then at least resolved. "You've brought representatives of conquered and marginal species to this meeting," Esrelva said. "I've brought colleagues," Akafer said pleasantly. "Shall we eat while we talk? The food's getting cold." The table was long and set with what Esrelva gradually understood was deliberate care. The humans had clearly researched Vorathi dietary requirements. The portions on the Vorathi side of the table were raw, as was appropriate, and the protein profiles visible in the dishes were consistent with what Vorathi metabolism favored. The humans were eating something cooked. The Seth ate something Esrelva couldn't identify that smelled vaguely of deep water. It was, she had to admit, thoughtful. "The Granfeld Protocol," said Admiral Akafer, after a few minutes of the peculiar silence of beings from different species eating in the same room. "You've heard us mention it. You probably want to know what it is." "Your communications officer seemed to find the encryption interesting," said Esrelva. Akafer nodded. "It's a treaty, a mutual defense framework you might call it." He gestured at the Seth and Prothean across the table. "The Seth brought us something when they arrived 6 weeks ago. They brought us data. Everything they'd compiled in 4 years of watching the Vorathi expansion, fleet movements, tactical patterns, weapon systems, the complete history of every species you've encountered since your first expansion wave." He picked up something from his plate and ate it without hurrying. "You've conquered 42 worlds, Commander, in 300 years. 43, Esrelva said. The Seth's second colony was taken 3 weeks ago. 43, HFY agreed without flinching. Of the species on those 43 worlds, 11 are functionally extinct. The rest exist as a labor class within your hegemony. He paused. That's a remarkable record. HFY was watching him carefully. The warmth in his voice had not shifted, which was strange. Most species, when confronted with the Vorathi record, displayed one of two responses: terror or righteous fury. Both were comprehensible. Both were, ultimately, useful. The human was displaying neither. He sounded, if anything, like a professional discussing an interesting case study. "Your point," said HFY. "My point is pattern recognition." HFY set down his utensil. "When I look at your expansion history, I see something specific. You encounter a species. You assess their military capacity. If their capacity is below a certain threshold, you conquer them. Every time, without exception, the calculus is the same. Can they hurt us enough to make the cost of conquest exceed the benefit of what we take?" He paused. "The answer has always been no. Until now." HFY kept her expression neutral. "You have 17 ships." "Now, yes." HFY looked at her steadily. "Ask me about the rest." The presentation that followed was not what HFY had expected. She had expected bluster. Species facing conquest often attempted to exaggerate their capabilities, to make themselves seem more formidable than they were. She had learned to discount such presentations heavily. The Vorathi had excellent intelligence-gathering methods, and the intelligence they had gathered on humanity had not suggested any military capacity beyond what was visible in orbit. But as a human named Colonel Asant, small, precise, with the manner of someone who had spent a long time organizing large amounts of information into efficient form, began laying out what she called the full Granfeld architecture, HFY began to understand that the intelligence had been wrong. Not about the ships. The 17 ships were real, and they were the limit of what humanity had in this system. But humanity, it turned out, was not in only this system. 437 years of spaceflight, Asant said, displaying a star map that expanded and expanded as she spoke. 212 years since our first successful colony ship. At current count, she paused with the practiced timing of someone who knew the number was going to matter. Humanity maintains permanent settlements on 68 worlds, moons, and large station platforms, spread across a volume of space approximately 19 light-years in diameter. HFY stared at the map. The Vorathi expansion history covered a similar volume, but the Vorathi had been expanding for 300 years. The humans had been expanding for barely half that time. "You colonized quickly," she said. "We breed quickly," said Asant without particular pride. "And we're uncomfortable with limits." She advanced the display. "Of those 68 settlements, 11 have independent shipbuilding capacity. The vessels produced at those facilities don't match Vorathi warship for warship. But the question isn't individual ship capability, is it?" She looked at HFY directly. "The question is, what does it cost you?" "You're describing a war of attrition," HFY said. "I'm describing the math," said Asant. "Your fleet is your 5th expansion wave. Your home system can produce, at maximum sustainable capacity, approximately 40 new warships per year. A war with humanity, accounting for your current fleet losses and the capacity of our 11 shipbuilding systems, operating at sustainable, not emergency, production rates, results in your fleet reaching effective zero in 22 years. Our production outpaces your losses beginning in year 8. Silence. "And that," said Admiral HFY from the end of the table, "is just humanity." He let the word land. Then he gestured at the Seth and the Prothean. "The Seth can't fight you. They know it, we know it." He paused. "But the Seth are extraordinary engineers. You've never had the patience for detailed intelligence work, Commander. The Vorathi conquer fast and move on. But if you'd spent more time studying the species you've absorbed, you'd know that Seth Engineering contributed more to the development of reliable fold space navigation than any other single civilization in this sector. He let that settle. We've been working together for 6 weeks. The navigation improvements they've shared with us have increased our effective fleet range by 30%. Liaison Speaker Veth spoke for the first time. Her voice was high and quick, the way Seth voices always were, but steady. "We do not fight," she said. "We support. We build. We have been building since you destroyed our second colony. We have been building for you." She looked at the humans when she said it. It was not quite gratitude. It was something more complicated. "The Protheans," said Akefer, "have 400 years of detailed astronomical survey data. Every star system within 40 light-years, every resource body, every potential colony site." He looked at fleet analyst Marrow. "They've shared all of it." Marrow's wide eyes regarded Esrelva without expression. "You passed through our system 11 years ago," the Prothean said. "You determined we had nothing worth taking. You were correct. We did not have anything worth taking." A pause. "We have since traded for things that might interest you." "The Granfeld Protocol," Akefer said quietly, "is not a military alliance. It's something more specific than that." He folded his hands on the table. "It's a framework for making conquest unprofitable. Specifically, unprofitable for you." Part 3, the math. The next 2 hours were the strangest of Esrelva's career. She had walked into the station expecting either a negotiating theater species trying to buy time, or a trap. She had brought her officers prepared for both. What she had not prepared for was a detailed, meticulous, entirely calm economic and strategic analysis of why conquering humanity would be a poor investment decision. The humans did this without hostility. That was the part that kept catching her off guard. They presented the data with the same matter-of-fact energy one might use to discuss agricultural yields. The Protheans' survey data filled in strategic pictures she hadn't known were incomplete. The Seth speaker contributed engineering assessments that her own technical officers found themselves leaning forward to follow. At one point, her tactical officer Dasketh asked a question about the Seth fold space drive modifications he'd spotted in the display. Not strategically, just technically interested. The Seth engineer across the table answered him with evident enthusiasm, and for approximately 4 minutes, a Vorathi officer and a Seth engineer had a detailed technical conversation about folded spatial mathematics as though they were colleagues at a conference. Esrelva had to redirect the discussion back to the protocol. "What you're describing," she said finally, when the data presentation had concluded, "is a scenario in which conquering Earth is technically feasible but strategically self-destructive. Your proposal is that we recognize this and withdraw." "Our proposal," said Akefer, "is a great deal more interesting than that." He smiled again. That infuriating, easy, completely genuine smile. "We're not asking you to go away." Esrelva waited. "We're asking you to consider a different relationship." "We are the Vorathi hegemony," said Esrelva. "We do not enter into relationships with smaller species. We govern them." "You govern their labor," said Akefer, "their worlds, their resources, and in exchange they live in permanent subordination in a system designed around your needs." He paused. "How's that working out, strategically speaking?" "We control 43 worlds." "You control 43 worlds," agreed Akefer. "Population of approximately 12 billion non-Vorathi. You govern them with approximately 800 million Vorathi, of whom about half are directly involved in hegemony administration." He looked at her. "You're stretched. Your administrative load is already at the edge of what your home population can sustain. Adding Earth, 68 worlds, 11 billion humans, 212 years of colonial infrastructure. To that administrative burden would either require you to stop all further expansion for the next 60 years, or to reduce your administrative presence in your current holdings to levels that historically correlate with colonial instability. He glanced at Asant. What did our models put the probability of uprisings in the hegemony's outer holdings within 30 years at, under that scenario? 63% for significant civil unrest, said Asant. 41% for active rebellion in at least 2 systems. You've done modeling on our internal stability, said HFY. We've done a great deal of modeling, said HFY quietly. We've had 6 weeks and we're very motivated. The third hour was the one that changed things. It was not more data. It was a question, and the question came not from a human, but from liaison speaker Veth. Commander HFY, said the Seth in her rapid, precise voice, may I ask something? HFY looked at the small being across the table, prey animal, soft-bodied, enormous frightened eyes, a species that existed by evolutionary heritage at the absolute bottom of any predator-prey hierarchy the Vorathi cared to draw. Ask, said HFY. Why did you conquer Seth space? HFY blinked. The resources were valuable, the location was strategically useful. Yes, said Veth, and before that the Herod systems, the Pelth cluster, the Dwen expanse. Why did you conquer those? Resources, strategic position, standard expansion protocol. And when you had resources and strategic position, said Veth, what did you use them for? The question hung in the air. HFY opened her mouth to answer with the obvious response, to secure further expansion, to strengthen the hegemony's position, to ensure the Vorathi remained the dominant power in the sector, and stopped. Because the question, she realized, was not actually simple. We expanded, she said finally. To acquire resources, said Veth. Yes. Which you then used to expand further, to acquire more resources, which you used to expand further. The Seth's enormous eyes were steady on hers. Commander, in 300 years of expansion. What have you built? The silence lasted a long time. You've built the capacity to conquer, said Veth, without cruelty. You've built the largest military force in this sector. You've built administrative systems capable of governing 43 worlds. She paused. The Seth built fold space navigation stable enough for generation ships. The Protheans built astronomical survey systems so precise that fleet analyst Marrow can tell you the composition of any star within 40 light-years to 4 decimal places. The humans built, she glanced at HFY. I will let you describe what humans build. HFY was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had lost none of its warmth, but it had gained something else, something that HFY's translation matrix labeled, after a moment's processing, as asterisk conviction. We build communities, he said. We're very bad at a lot of things, Commander. We're slow, we're fragile, we get sick. We disagree with each other constantly. I mean, the level of argument that goes on in human civilization on any given day would probably give you a headache. We've made terrible decisions as a species. We've hurt each other in ways that embarrass us to remember. He paused. But we are extraordinarily good at making things work. At finding ways to cooperate with beings we have nothing in common with. At looking at a resource and asking not just, how do I take this, but what can I build with it? He looked at the Seth, at the Prothean, then back at HFY. 6 weeks ago, liaison speaker Veth arrived in this system on a refugee transport with 40,000 Seth survivors and a hard drive full of data. Today she's sitting at a table with a Vorathi war fleet in orbit, helping to negotiate a treaty she had no reason to think would ever work. He paused. That's not Seth courage. That's not human strategy. That's what happens when beings who could either fight each other or help each other decide to ask which option actually leads somewhere. Part 4, The Predator's Question. HFY left the table at one point. She told her officers she needed air. The station recycled its atmosphere in a way that Vorathi physiologies found slightly overpressured, and walked alone to a viewport in the station's outer ring. Below her, the human planet turned. Blue-white, a ridiculous amount of surface water. From orbit, it looked vulnerable in the way that all habited worlds looked vulnerable, a thin-shelled thing full of organic complexity, surrounded by the vast, indifferent machinery of space. She had orbited 43 such worlds in her career. She had given the order to begin bombardment on 8 of them. The others had surrendered before it came to that. She tried to remember if she had ever stood at a viewport and looked at one of those worlds the way she was looking at this one. She thought with some discomfort that she had not. "The view helps, I find," said a voice behind her. She did not turn immediately. She had heard the footsteps, human footsteps, the specific weight distribution of someone heavier than he appeared, which was consistent with what she'd read about human musculature density. Admiral Akafor, alone, having followed her without any of his officers. She turned. He was standing at a respectful distance, hands in his pockets, looking not at her but at the planet below. In the station's ambient light, he looked older than he had on the comm screen, more lines around the eyes, more gray in the fur on his head. "You're not afraid," she said. "I'm afraid," he said immediately. "I've been afraid since the Seth transport docked 6 weeks ago and Veth walked off it and told us what was coming." He paused. "But fear doesn't mean the same thing for humans as I think it might for other species. It doesn't mean stop. It means pay attention." Esrelva considered this. "Your species was prey once," she said. "Before spaceflight, before technology, before civilization. On your homeworld, other predators ate you." "Plenty of things tried," said Akafor. "We didn't taste good enough to go extinct, apparently." "How did you survive, before technology?" He was quiet for a moment. "We outthought things," he said, "and we did something else." He paused. "We learned to care about each other, not just family, not just our own group. We developed the capacity to extend care to strangers, to beings who were different, to beings who weren't us." He looked at her sideways. "It's a survival mechanism, actually. Works better than claws, turns out. Claws you can only use against one thing at a time. Care scales." Esrelva looked back at the planet. "You're asking us to care about you," she said. "I'm asking you to consider whether your current strategy is actually in your interest," said Akafor. "I'm asking you to apply the same intelligence you use to plan conquest to the question of what conquest is actually for." He paused. "The Vorathi are remarkable, Commander. I mean that without flattery. 300 years of sustained expansion across 7 star systems, maintaining administrative coherence across 43 worlds, with military technology that's advanced faster than any other species in this sector. That's extraordinary." He paused. "That's a civilization capable of building almost anything, if it decided to build rather than take." "We take what we need." "You take what you've already decided you need," said Akafor. "And what you've decided you need is more of what you already have." He turned to face her fully. "Predator to predator, Commander. The best hunters I know don't hunt more than they can eat. The ones who take everything leave themselves in a stripped landscape with nothing to hunt." He paused. "We watched it happen on our own homeworld. Species that took everything went extinct. Species that found equilibrium survived." He glanced back at the planet. "Earth is still producing prey animals, 4 billion years into the experiment, because at some point the predators and the prey found a balance." "You're proposing balance," said Esrelva. "I'm proposing trade," said Akafor. "Actual trade. The Seth have technology your engineers have been quietly salivating over for the last 2 hours. I watched your officer Dasketh try very hard to look like he wasn't excited about the fold space modifications, and I want you to know he did not succeed." The human's mouth curved. "The Prothean survey data would take your own astronomers 500 years to replicate. And humanity," he looked at her, "humanity knows how to make systems work. We've been doing it with species we barely understand for 2 centuries. We're good at it." In exchange for what? Said Esrelva. For what you're already offering by being here, said HFY. Protection. You're the dominant military power in this sector. You'll be the dominant military power for the foreseeable future. Nothing threatens Seth space if Seth space is under Vorathi protection as an allied nation rather than a conquered territory. He paused. The species you've absorbed, some of them would come back, not as subjects, as partners. The difference is enormous, Commander. You know what a human who is forced to work for you produces. You don't yet know what a human who chooses to work with you produces. He let that land. What humans choose to do, he said quietly, tends to surprise people. Part 5, The Decision. Esrelva called a staff meeting on the consuming dark 3 hours after returning to the fleet. She had her tactical officer, her strategic analyst, her engineering officer, whose name was now slightly harder to say with a straight face since he'd spent 40 minutes in animated conversation with a Seth engineer about field geometry, and her second-in-command, Elder Commander Trathsal, who was old enough to have participated in the third expansion wave and had opinions about everything. She laid out everything they'd been shown, all of it, including the parts she found uncomfortable. The attrition projections, the administrative load analysis, the fold space modifications, the Prothean survey data, the human argument about predator-prey equilibrium that she was fairly sure she was going to spend a long time thinking about. When she finished, there was silence. Then Trathsal said, "The data is real." "Our own sensors confirm the human fleet figures," said Dasketh. "We've independently verified the colonization numbers from what we can cross-reference. The fold space drive assessments," he paused. "Analyst engineer Vreth has reviewed the preliminary specifications the Seth shared. He believes they are genuine." Analyst engineer Vreth, who had asked the embarrassing questions about field geometry, had the grace not to look too pleased. "The modifications are substantive," he said, in the tone of someone trying to be professional about it. "Representing approximately 40 years of independent development beyond our current systems. The Seth navigation architecture is," he paused, looked at Esrelva. "It is very good, Commander." Trathsal made a low sound. 300 years, he said. "We have not allied, we have not traded, we have taken." "It has served us well," said Esrelva. "It served us well," said Trathsal, "when what we were taking was enough." He was quiet for a moment. "The humans' point about administrative capacity, the model they showed. 63% probability of unrest in outer holdings. Within 30 years, Trathsal looked at the display. "I have been in this fleet for 60 years, Esrelva. I remember the second expansion wave. We had 18 worlds then and the administration was already straining." He paused. "We have not talked about this. We do not talk about this kind of thing." "No," agreed Esrelva. "The humans talk about it constantly," said Trathsal. "That was obvious from the presentation. They argue about it, analyze it, build models, revise the models, argue about the models." He paused. "I found it irritating. I find that irritation informative." Dasketh said carefully, "Commander, what is your assessment?" Esrelva was quiet for a long moment. She was looking at the star map on the display, the human colonial network, spread across 19 light-years, growing at a rate that their own expansion had never matched because the Vorathi, when they found a new world, had to conquer it before they could use it, while the humans simply went there. Built things. Invited beings to dinner. She thought about the Seth speaker, the straightness of the small being's spine, the steadiness of the enormous eyes. She thought about the human engineer whose work had contributed to fold space navigation, sitting at a table with Vorathi officers, and explaining his mathematics without apparent fear. She thought about equilibrium, about what it meant to be a predator in a landscape you were systematically stripping of everything worth hunting. "My assessment," said Esrelva finally, is that the humans set a very good table. Trathsal's neck frills rippled the Vorathi expression for involuntary amusement. He suppressed it quickly, with the dignity of his rank. "And the protocol," he said. "We will request a second meeting," said Esrelva. "We will bring our own economists and our own engineers. We will bring the complete administrative load data from our outer holdings, not summary reports. The actual data." She paused. "If the humans' analysis holds under scrutiny, we will negotiate. And if it doesn't hold under scrutiny—" Esrelva looked at the viewport, at the blue-white planet. "Then we will have an accurate picture of our strategic position," she said, "which is more than we had this morning." She turned from the viewport. "Tell Admiral Akafor that we accept the invitation to a second dinner, and tell him," she paused, "tell him to bring the Seth engineer who explained the field geometry modifications. Analyst engineer Vreth has follow-up questions." Epilogue 3 years later. The Granfeld Compact. The name had changed slightly in translation, which the humans found funny for reasons that took 18 months to fully explain to the Vorathi diplomatic corps, came into formal effect on the 3rd anniversary of the *consuming dark *''s arrival in the Sol system. It was not a simple document. Human-drafted frameworks rarely were. The humans had a saying about the devil being in the details, which made a great deal more sense once someone explained what a devil was, which required explaining the concept of a devil, which required a fairly substantial detour into human religious and mythological history that Esrelva had found, to her own surprise, genuinely absorbing. The compact established a mutual non-aggression framework between the Vorathi hegemony and what was formally titled the Coalition of Independent Systems, which was humanity, the Seth remnant population, the Prothean Compact, and 6 other species who had sent representatives to the second meeting with a speed that suggested they had been waiting for an opportunity with some urgency. A technology exchange framework. The Seth fold space modifications entered Vorathi engineering databases. Vorathi military encryption protocols, the best in the sector, arguably in known space, entered coalition communication infrastructure. The Prothean survey data went into a shared astronomical database that both the Vorathi and coalition researchers began mining immediately. A formal review process for the 11 species currently living under Vorathi governance as a labor class. This had been the hardest negotiation. It had lasted 8 months, and there were 17 documented occasions during those 8 months when Esrelva had strongly considered simply leaving and beginning the bombardment. What had stopped her on most of those occasions was a memory. A small being with enormous eyes and a spine that was straighter than it had any business being, saying, "We have been building for you." The review process did not immediately change everything. Change, humans had explained more than once, was a process, not an event. But it established that the status of those 11 species was a matter of ongoing negotiation rather than permanent fact, which was more than any of them had had before. There were Vorathi hardliners who called Esrelva a traitor to the expansion mandate. There were coalition voices who said the compact was capitulation, that trusting the Vorathi was foolishness, that the first sign of weakness would bring the fleet back. Both were wrong, as far as Esrelva could assess. Not because the concerns were irrational, they weren't, but because they both assumed the relationship was static, that it had to be one thing and stay that thing. The humans, and increasingly the Seth, seemed to understand that relationships were not static. They were processes. They required attention and adjustment, and the constant, uncomfortable work of taking someone else's perspective seriously. This, Esrelva had come to think, was what the humans meant when they talked about building things. On the anniversary of the compact's formal signing, there was a dinner. A proper one this time, with more attendees, several hundred beings across the species, held on Earth itself. in a city called Accra that Akafar said had personal significance to him, in a hall large enough to accommodate the range of body plans, environmental tolerances, and dietary requirements of the assembled guests. Esrelva sat near the middle of the table. To her left was analyst engineer Vreth, who had been exchanging long technical messages with the Seth engineer Pelveth for 2 years, and had recently proposed a joint research initiative that both of their home academies were cautiously considering. To her right was Trathsal, who was 67 years old, and had spent 30 of those years believing that strength was the only language the galaxy understood. He had, over the course of 3 years, begun to revise this. "Still irritating," he said, watching the room, the noise of it, the overlapping conversations, the 3 separate arguments he could identify from where he was sitting. "Still informative," said Esrelva. Across the table, Admiral Akafar was laughing at something liaison speaker Veth had said. The Seth speaker had a quality that, over 3 years, Esrelva had come to recognize as humor, dry, precise, slightly unexpected. It apparently translated well to humans. Less well to Vorathi, though Esrelva was beginning to catch the rhythm of it. Akafar caught her eye and raised a glass. A toast gesture. The humans were extremely fond of those. She raised hers in return. The liquid inside was something the human caterers had sourced specifically for Vorathi physiology. It tasted, to her palate, of iron and deep water. It was quite good. Predator to predator. The galaxy, it turned out, was a great deal larger than the things you could take from it. It was larger still than the things you could build. But building, Esrelva had come to think, was at least a direction. It was at least somewhere to point. And somewhere to point was, in the end, what distinguished a civilization from a hunger. She drank. Around her the dinner went on loud, complicated, frequently confusing, occasionally frustrating and unmistakably, undeniably pointing somewhere. And word count, ~9, 750 words runtime, minutes at 160 WPM,